Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you. It is so good to see all of you this morning. I can't find my people. They're not in their normal seats. I don't know why. Before the 8 o'clock service, which we've been calling the run-through, a parishioner came up to me and said, "Did you see the cover of the Sun this morning?" And I was like, actually, I usually do check it before I come to church, but no, I didn't. She said, "There's an article about how your sermon today, it's the Super Bowl of Sundays, and you better," she said, pardon the expression, "nail it." So just let's set the expectations down here, people, okay? But this church looks like a Super Bowl church, doesn't it? It is beautiful. And I tell you, some things haven't changed over the centuries. I want to thank the band of faithful women who made that happen for all of us, because God's beauty in this space does indeed lift our hearts. The first celebrations of Easter didn't begin inside a church sanctuary. Some churches still do this. They gather outside the church at early dawn after a long night of vigil, greeting the new day, the light of Christ. When that sliver of light pierces that particular blue of morning darkness, that can be a precious time. That stillness, knowing with some eager anticipation that it all gets to begin again. It's the promise of what a new day might bring. But early dawn doesn't always call forth feelings of hope and promise, does it? Especially when we don't get a good night's sleep. And I don't imagine that Mary and those other women did that first Easter morning, since they were the ones who had been there for all that had happened before. And I'm sure many of you, like me, know what it is to wake up in the early dawn on the day after. The day after something has ended. Someone you love is gone. Your tired eyes pop open, and at first there's just blankness, and then it hits you. You remember, and the light just brings awareness, not hope or promise, and maybe you're fortunate enough to let that light just give you the strength to get up and start moving. And that's what Mary and those women did, because there was work to do. Women of the first century surely knew the ceremonies around death. That was something I'm sure they were all too familiar with. They had prepared their spices and their oils, and they set out to get to work, just like we do when someone dies. Because we know there's something necessary about the rites and the rituals that will help us move through those feelings of finality that death always brings. And yet, when they arrive at that tomb, another light breaks into their worlds, adding to their confusion in an empty space. A light radiating holiness, but not proclaiming a statement as we are used to angels doing, as in, "Do not be afraid," but instead posing a question. What are you doing here? Why do you look for the living among the dead? Don't you remember what Jesus told you? Don't you remember what he said he was going to do? All of us need stories and proclamations and signs to remember, because just like those women, it is very hard to trust God's promise of resurrection, God's blessed assurance that we will always, now and forever, be brought to new life. So 2 caterpillars were once hanging out in a garden. And above them fluttered a beautiful monarch butterfly. And one caterpillar turned to the other and said, "You'll never get me up in one of those things." Butterflies are one of the most ancient Christian symbols of resurrection. It's crazy how a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. Instinctively, at some point, the caterpillar buries itself within a self-made tomb, a chrysalis that hardens all around it. And then something happens, something weird and kind of gross that we don't even entirely understand. Simplistically put, the caterpillar dissolves within that tomb, and then somehow it reforms as something else entirely. And one spring morning, the top cracks open and life emerges. A new creation, no longer inching along the ground, but soaring, gliding upon the air, a whole new perspective of sight. No more grazing on leaves. Now it's sipping on the nectar of God's beautiful variety of flora. In so many ways, butterflies are a most apt symbol of how life is changed, not ended, just as God promises us. Maybe that's why God made them, and everything else we behold outside. God knows we have a hard time trusting what we cannot see. We get the joke between the caterpillars because it is hard to walk by faith and not by sight. Just like the caterpillar says, we don't want to let go of the identities we know, the realities we know, what we see in front of us. But transformation and new life requires at some point for us to let go of what we see and know, and to live into dreams and possibilities that we can only imagine, relying on a power greater than ourselves to get us there. Easter Sunday is a Super Bowl Sunday of the church. That's why y'all come this day. And we know what it is we're going to get, a beautiful sanctuary, beautiful people in their Sunday best, beautiful music and hymnody to lift our spirits and strengthen our hearts. These are the rites and rituals we've created in our time to affirm resurrection faith. But church doesn't make Easter happen. Easter is a pattern that is happening all the time that God revealed again and definitively through Christ. We need the rites and rituals. We need a lifetime of Sundays to remember what the prophets and then Jesus told us God will always do: restore, rebuild, reconcile, and resurrect. Easter happens when people fall on their knees in a city street, praying and sobbing and singing and crying as they watch a building consumed by flame that has stood as a testament to resurrection for 800 years. That has played out in sacred story before too. And when we see it, we might remember what God told King David as King David gazed at the beautiful house of God he had built. Do you think there's a house that can hold me? God said. We might remember what Jesus told the woman at the well. You know, the time's going to come when y'all are going to stop arguing about where and when to worship and realize it's about worshiping in spirit and in truth. We might remember what Jesus told those disciples before he died. Inevitably, all the stones of all the buildings will tumble down. And then we might remember that in every single one of those stories, through the millennia, through people like you and me, God restores, rebuilds, reconciles, and resurrects. Not buildings, but people. Not institutions, but communities. New creations, new expressions of life-giving truth will always break forth into our world. The light will always overcome the darkness. You know, I never thought I'd do this for a living. Never imagined it in a million years. All of you have seen and experienced resurrection. And sometimes, the longer I do this, I think a lot of our religious speak, it just comes with too much baggage. It's loaded with misconceptions, words like resurrection, reinforced over the centuries, sadly, by a power-hungry church, a power that is indeed passing away. Faith is not contingent on a belief or some set of statements that we give our intellectual assent to. Faith is a verb, and it's a lot like light. We don't see it. It helps us see. God helps us see these patterns of new beginnings like butterflies and springtime and sunrise all the time. We are constantly starting over, day by day by day. And today, at early dawn, Christ's light broke into our world. Hallelujah. Today, like every precious day you and I are given, may that light help us remember what Jesus said. There is no other commandment greater than this. Love one another as God loves you. If you live that way, you will see resurrection all the time. Hallelujah! Christ is risen. The Lord is risen indeed. Hallelujah!